Hello, and welcome to today's FP Virtual Dialogue, a very timely and important conversation about the deteriorating humanitarian crisis across Northern Central America and the new approaches that are needed to address the complex challenges and root causes of forced migration. My name is Allison Carlson, and I'm the Managing Director of FP Analytics, Foreign Policies Research and Advisory Division. And it's my pleasure to be your host this morning. Around the world, the news outlets are bringing attention to the worsening conditions in Northern Central America as more and more people are fleeing poverty, violence, climate-related disasters, and other challenges, which of course have been compounded and exacerbated by COVID-19. Since 2014, over 2 million people are estimated to have left El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And as many of you know, the Biden administration is seeking to address the root causes of forced migration by ramping up diplomatic engagement, prioritizing governance issues, and regional economic development. The administration's approach is really reflecting a growing realization of the need for longer-term investments and strategies to mitigate these complex risks, and the need to focus on building an environment that's really dedicated to regional development and one that fosters resilience. This notion and focus on resilience was actually the focus of a first of its kind simulation that we conducted last Friday in partnership with World Vision and the World Bank, which brought together leaders and an impressive group from the region and experts who are really trying to work through identifying new pathways for collaboration and partnership to address the root causes that are contributing to forced migration from the region, and really think through substantive, concrete means to foster local development and local capacity building for the longer term. We'll talk about some of those takeaways today, but really focus on bringing together some of the leading experts from government, civil society, and others around the world. So thank you again for joining us today. And first of all, before we dive into the conversation, just want to go through a few housekeeping notes so that everyone can participate. We want this to be as engaging and interactive as possible, even though we're on the virtual platform. First off, I'm pleased to announce also that we'll be offering this conversation and dialogue today with Spanish language translation for those of you who are logged in on Zoom. If you'd like to listen to the Spanish audio, you can click the interpretation icon, which you should be able to find at the bottom of your Zoom window, and you can select Spanish there. You can also select mute to the original audio if you just prefer to hear the only Spanish version translation. We've also reserved a portion of the conversation for questions. So as I said, we want this to be interactive, engaging, and we really want to hear from you. We have hundreds of people joining us from around the world today, so please chime in. You can do so if you're on Zoom. Many of you, I'm sure, are quite familiar with this by now, but you can click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And when you do so, we'd really appreciate it if you could identify yourself. Please include your name, your organization, and where you're writing from. For those who aren't on Zoom, if you're joining us by phone or by live stream, you can email us. And we'll be collecting your questions there. That email address is events@foreignpolicy.com. And also we're across a number of social media platforms today. So we also encourage you to chime in there. And you can do so by using the hashtag #ResilientCentralAmerica. Okay, enough of the housekeeping notes, and let's dive into the conversation. First, I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker to set the stage and to help us, establish a framework and understanding of why resilience should really be at the forefront of tackling these issues that are contributing to forced migration. Welcome, Edgar Sandoval. Edgar is the president and CEO of World Vision US. It's great to have you with us here today. Thank you so much for joining us and for your partnership in this project.
Allison, it's great to be here. Thank you.
So just stemming from the conversations that we were having on Friday as part of this simulation, a number of insights were derived and findings from that, all of which we'll be compiling as part of a report that we'll be distributing as well. But just to kick off the conversation today and ground us in this framework of resilience, You know, several of the issues that we were grappling with were the complex nature of risks and the multi-dimensional aspects of them, from hurricanes and droughts to COVID-19, systemic violence, and a number of governance challenges throughout the region. And in the conversation with the participants, one of the things that was really illuminated was the breaking of a social contract and how much investment needs to be made in social capital. And by that, I mean the networks and the connections between government, civil society, international organizations, so that there's a much more cohesive and integrated approach to addressing local capacity building. One of the things that came up as well is the need for country platforms. Oftentimes, development projects, aid, etc., are siloed, and practitioners are working sort of on their own in discrete spaces, and the need for much more integrated involvement, collaboration among partners that's data-driven and really adaptive to the environment rather than separated from each other. And so I'd love to hear from you and from the perspective of World Vision. I know you're very active in the region, and this resilience framework is really core to everything that you do. So I'd love to hear from you to set the stage for the conversation today. How do those takeaways resonate with you and also relate to World Vision's work in the region?
Thank you, Allison. Let me just start by saying a word of thanks to Foreign Policy and the World Bank for partnering with us on this critical topic, and to our distinguished panel for joining us for what I know will be a rich discussion. Listen, I am excited and energized by last week's simulation exercise to come up with groundbreaking ways to address Central American fragility and forced migration. At World Vision, we focus on building resilience as a key part of our work in Central America. And for us, that means empowering communities with the resources and skills to cope with what you mentioned, multiple risks and crises. See, we found that when people are resilient and equipped with these tools, they can bend but not break in the face of shocks, even when those shocks come one after another, or even simultaneously, as we've seen recently. In Central America, increasingly, we are seeing this pattern of multiple overlapping crises, frequent severe weather events, pandemics, instability, economic shocks, all happening at the same time, leaving people with, very few choices besides migration. And in the face of this changing and complex landscape, the international community, we must dramatically adapt as well and shift the thinking on how to approach problems of regional fragility, development, and humanitarian response in ways that place resilience and a resilience approach really at the center. As the simulation identified, this is a break from, you could call it foreign assistance as usual. We need to break from that and focus primarily on meeting basic human needs, right? Sometimes with a short-term, perhaps even single issue lens, and not always with a focus on the complex, multidimensional risks that disrupt people's lives and livelihoods. Resilience is at the core of World Vision's work, and the simulation takeaways have not only affirmed that we're on the right path, but also provided all of us with new ideas for what USAID, for instance, calls CLA, collaborating, learning, and adapting, which is essential for doing this work. I'm really pleased that USAID is able to join us today, as they have been doing innovative work on resilience for a long time, not only in food security, but increasingly in building resilient health systems and education systems in fragile settings. Now, one last point on this question. World Vision recently rolled out an ambitious resilience framework that we call Hope at Home, Building Resilience in Central America. This framework supports the work of communities and governments in repairing social contracts and building social capital, as you mentioned, at different levels to anticipate and tackle the root issues of fragility. Now, of course, no one can do any of this alone. We have strong partnerships with faith institutions and faith leaders in Central America, for instance. As a Christian organization, World Vision knows faith plays a highly influential role with both people and societies, from the spectrum of service provision to access to the most violent communities to motivating behavior change, which is what we're after at the end of the day. So I am glad that was affirmed in the simulation. We also engage with other critical stakeholders, from the communities themselves to local governments, private companies, private donors, and many more. The emphasis on collective action in the simulation truly inspired us to examine also how can we expand these partnerships even further, Allison.
Thank you, Edgar. That's really helpful and helps to set a frame for the conversation today. I know resilience is really important for World Vision, but I understand it's also quite personal. If you could tell us a little bit more about your background and your story and why this is so important to you.
I'll mention a couple of things about my background, but before I talk about my background, I do want to answer the first part of your question. Why is it so important to World Vision? Well, in the face of concurrent crisis in Central America, we're seeing that coping mechanisms, where they exist, are increasingly being stretched to the breaking point. So this approach is needed now more than ever. 2020 was a devastating year. In the middle of the COVID pandemic, back-to-back hurricanes affected 7 million people. People lost loved ones. They lost their crops. They lost access to their markets. Their coping mechanisms, such as skipping meals and selling assets, just aren't enough, even with humanitarian aid. And so a dire situation has become really a desperate situation that is fueling the surge in forced migration for desperate families. Last month, we saw the highest number in history of people arriving at the southern US border. Now, back to my story now. Here's the thing I know from personal experience. No one wants to leave the people they love and the place they know. When I was a teenager in Venezuela, my family fell in hard times. So I can relate to coping mechanisms. We started skipping meals. Mom went first. We sold assets, such as our car. We received help in the most unexpected ways. My best friend, would bring us basic food staples every now and then. But here's the thing, it wasn't enough. Eventually, I had to leave. I had to leave my mother and the people I loved, and Venezuela, the country I knew, to move back to the United States, which I had left as a toddler. Also, both my parents are from Guatemala. So you see, my experience and my heritage give me an empathy for Central American families. And my faith is really what compels me and everyone at World Vision to act, to seek life in all of its fullness for the children and the families, especially those vulnerable in Central America. And we need to do that as fast and effectively as possible. That's why World Vision has been working in the region for over 40 years. And we commit to staying between 10 and 15 years in the communities where we work, helping people build resilience to economic challenges, environmental shocks, and societal vulnerabilities, because it does take time.
Absolutely. And I know you've been working there quite some time, as you've described. Can you give us a concrete example of how World Vision is working now and how you're seeing it have impact on the ground?
I'll be happy to do that, Alice. And I'll never forget talking to Josue Sosa. Josue is a farmer I met when I visited Honduras in the early 2019. When he was in his 20s, Josue believed he would also need to migrate to find opportunities. But then he participated in a World Vision project called Thrive, which stands for Transforming Household Resilience in Vulnerable Environments. And he learned to absorb and adapt to shocks and crises. He saved his money from working on a farm to pay for university and to get a degree in teaching so that he could train all the farmers in his community. Well, I recently heard from Josue again. The past year has been tough. COVID-19 swept through his town, bringing lockdowns that closed borders and halted travel. He saw produce like tomatoes rotting on the vine. Locally owned small businesses close and factory jobs disappear, and most still haven't come back. Then came the hurricanes, one after another, washing out bridges, flooding homes, and blowing off roofs. He says that more people in town are talking about migrating, but he's not Josue. Despite all those challenges, his small farming business survived. Josue is resilient. His coping capacities are strong, and he has found hope at home. And that's the kind of resilience more families need to prevent them from being forced to migrate. And here's the thing, I found this very exciting from Josue. He is now helping to do that by working with World Vision to help build others' resilience in his community. Now, unfortunately, I've also heard from our staff in Honduras that, and in the rest of the region, that household access to food continues to be limited and will be limited until probably early fall. So, Allison, now is really the time. Now is the time to increase funding, coordination, partnerships for resilience, not just disaster recovery, but the hard work of creating opportunities, better managing risks and disasters, and enabling people to thrive at home. As the simulation found, right, multiple stakeholders and cross-border collaboration is a key requirement for this to happen. And this is one of the reasons I'm looking forward to hearing from our other speakers today. You have an amazing panel of speakers. I'm so excited to hear from them and to hear how we can all work together to build resilience and lasting hope at home in Central America. So Allison, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you this morning.
Absolutely. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for the concrete examples, setting the stage, and for your partnership as well. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Edgar. So now we're going to turn to our next speaker, and we're absolutely thrilled to have Ricardo Zuniga, who is the Special Envoy for the Northern Triangle at the U.S. State Department, joining us today. He leads the U.S. efforts and advises the Secretary and Acting Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs, and coordinates closely with the National Security Council staff on the administration's comprehensive efforts to stem irregular migration to the U.S. and implement President Biden's multi-year $4 billion initiative to address root causes of migration in Central America. Welcome to the program, Ricardo. We're so thrilled to have you here.
Thank you, Allison. That's very, very pleased to be here.
Thank you so much. So, as we've discussed before, and also as we were talking about earlier on the program, these challenges facing the region are long-term and multidimensional. And the engagement with the U.S. in the region has been long-term as well, but I'd love to hear from you and your position now and the activities of the State Department and the U.S. government. How is this different? What's different this time, and what are your priorities for engagement now in addressing the root causes of migration?
Well, I think, first of all, I really think that the scenario presented by Edgar Sandoval is precisely the one that we see right now, that those mechanisms for resilience, the tools that were available, unfortunately, are all being strained at the same time. So what we're seeing is that you have multiple crises at the same time in already very fragile conditions that are forcing people to leave homes that they do not want to abandon. Of course, there is migration that takes place in an orderly and regular way. There are deep family connections, deep economic connections between the United States and Central America. But what we're talking about is people being displaced by events and being forced to leave under very precarious conditions. And of course, this has multiple negative effects. So our view is that we need to address these new strains in a comprehensive way. And in terms of what we're doing that's different from what we've done in past years, beginning especially in 2014, when we saw a very large wave of irregular mass migration that included unaccompanied children, we learned from our efforts in recent years. Part of that is to put a special focus on issues related to governance, because what we see is that we can make progress on the economic front and the humanitarian front, but that progress can be very easily derailed if we don't see efforts succeed in terms of providing security for investment, in terms of ensuring that there is not impunity for acts of corruption that are pilfering government resources, and that really draw down the ability of governments and societies to contend with these multiple challenges. So we've organized ourselves around 5 pillars that are supposed to work together and that are also intended to create an enabling environment, recognizing that foreign aid is not likely to provide solutions in itself. It's intended to enable solutions. So our 5 areas of focus are in the realm of combating corruption and strengthening democratic governance and advancing the rule of law. Second is promoting respect for human rights and labor rights and a free press. Our third is countering and preventing violence, extortion, and other crimes perpetrated by criminal organizations and trafficking networks. Fourth is combating sexual and gender-based domestic violence, and I can circle back to that in a moment because that's a particularly important area of focus. And finally, addressing economic insecurity and inequality, because again, in many cases, this is about opportunity, and as Edgar just laid out, even under precarious conditions, those who have found a way to contend with those difficult situations can fall back on a well-organized plan. So why don't I stop there and just note that I do think it is worth focusing somewhat on the issue of gender-based violence, because that is has such a deep and profound impact across the rest of the challenges facing societies in Central America.
Absolutely. And I'd just like to thank you for focusing on the governance issue. We actually had a question that was coming in from the audience specifically about that. And just to point to that attendee's question, he said that there's a perception that the Biden administration may bypass some government officials working with NGOs. And they highlighted a risk that Central American countries could become like Haiti, or there would be a situation like Haiti, and they're emphasizing the importance of strengthening government institutions to sustain those institutions and strengthen governance there. That's not to say certainly that involvement and engagement with NGOs and civil society is not necessary, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about that in a second, but thank you. To your point, absolutely, about strengthening governance. And if you could maybe just say a little bit more about what your efforts are doing in that regard.
So I absolutely agree that the idea is not to, there is a misperception sometimes in publics and even in government that most of our assistance is directed to governments, and that for a long time that has not been the case. We certainly make some assistance directly with governments that reaches them through multilateral development banks, where the United States is a large shareholder in many of the large regional banks. But much of our assistance in recent years has been directed through NGOs, through contract organizations that deliver assistance directly to beneficiaries. And at the same time, we have worked with governments to help them make investments and direct investments in terms of, for example, improving the efficiency of their court systems through digitizing court records, or, for instance, focusing on areas to improve transparency around customs and around tax collection. Again, with the aim of providing greater transparency and certainty for those, not just for citizens, but for those domestic and foreign investors who would be very interested in helping generate opportunities. In the area of the judiciary in particular, we think that has been a very important investment. At the same time, we're very concerned by the fact that there is intense pressure on court systems, including many that we've worked with, that is undermining confidence in their ability to be independent and to render decisions that are for the public good as opposed to for a particular beneficiary.
Thank you. Thank you for that and the follow-up. I'd like to circle back on what you were saying about violence against women, and also integrate that with how you're working with local organizations on the ground and civil society to that end. I understand that right now, Central America is one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a woman. And that has profound implications for security at the personal level, at the community level, and regionally as well. So could you speak for a few minutes about that priority and how you're working with local organizations there to address it?
Yes, well, actually, this is a really important point. Number one, I mentioned that our current approach is based on lessons that we've learned in recent years. One of those lessons is obvious on its face, but can be hard to implement. And And that is that your programming as a government needs to be highly informed by not just conditions on the ground, but actors who've been dealing with those conditions. So with respect to this question of gender-based violence, as you said, some of the highest rates in the world of gender-based violence are found in Central America. And that does lead directly to other challenges, other social challenges, and criminality, loss of hope, and so forth. And certainly in the economic sphere, it's an enormously problematic issue. And so the approach has been to do two things. The United States does bring the experience of other regions, but we also rely on information provided by local organizations to tell us about the particularities of the phenomenon in each country, and not just in each country, but in each community. And we use that to help us target assistance, for example, in the creation of networks of shelters, and in terms of establishing special police forces and special prosecutorial capacity, so that we are connecting victims to justice, to the justice system, in a way that they may not have had before. They may not have had confidence, and for good reason, or they may just have not known what to do. And we rely on local organizations not only to inform us how to structure our assistance, but also to provide sustainability going forward. And that applies to our larger approach to assistance in Central America now. That focus on NGOs and other entities is because whereas governments come and go, governments change, civil society has been a repository of positive contributions to societies across the region, and all the more so in recent years.
Thank you. And we have another question that's coming in related to security and one of the compounding and complex risk factors related to drug trafficking, and human trafficking as well. This is a question that comes in from Laura Gottsteiner. I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly. She's a correspondent with Reuters in Mexico and the Central America Bureau. And her question is, how does drug trafficking, and sometimes in collusion with government officials, contribute to migration, particularly from Honduras?
Well, this connection between organized crime and irregular migration is one that's growing. We're seeing a couple of different phenomena that are particularly concerning. One is that, as I mentioned, our focus on governance is because we recognize that corruption and weak governance contributes significantly to insecurity and discourages domestic and foreign investment. So it discourages the creation of opportunities. And that's a major contributing factor to irregular migration. There are two phenomena that are particularly concerning. One is the entry of organized crime money into political campaigns through campaign contributions, and not just at the national level, but at the municipal level. This is something that is frankly undermining the role of the state in providing security and access to justice and combating crime in many communities in the region, including in Honduras. And so the role, obviously, of organized crime is one that we've seen touch at many different levels. And this is something that unfortunately is not declining. It is something that requires intense attention, so that the role of the government in delivering the public good remains in the hands of the public and not in the hands of criminal organizations. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is that we have seen that criminal organizations are taking an increasing interest in providing not just the route of travel, but sometimes the financing of irregular migration. So through usury, through loans that involve the migrants' families turning over assets in exchange for working off the cost of migration. We're seeing that criminal organizations are moving in creating a vicious and negative cycle for those communities, because even if, for example, they travel and are either deported from the United States or they return voluntarily from the United States or from Mexico or wherever they've traveled, they're returning to much less than they left behind, which only contributes further to the undermining of stability in all of these communities.
Absolutely. And I know in addition to governance and addressing security issues, you're also working closely on local economic development and really working to foster and strengthen local businesses and economic opportunity in the region in an effort also to foster development, growth, and stem forced migration from the region. Could you talk a little bit more about those efforts as well?
Certainly. So this gets back to that point that I raised earlier about how all of these lines of effort are really interconnected. The vice president, through her call to action to the private sector, wanted to respond to what we see, what I've mentioned several times, which is a belief that among many of the people who migrate is they simply do not have opportunities at home and must leave for that reason. And so we believe that encouraging economic development, and not just in the areas where economic development is taking place already, and not just for those who are already doing well. This has to be broad-based economic growth. The only way that we believe you can achieve that is by offering that enabling environment of access to justice and ensuring that there is transparency in government accounting, that we are working together to encourage the ease of establishing and managing businesses, that governments are investing in infrastructure, and that ability to invest in infrastructure is made possible through the right kind of legislation. For example, in Guatemala, there's a deep need to approve a public-private partnership law and to approve one of the largest public-private efforts underway, which is a road between around to Puerto Quetzal that would significantly increase possibilities for investment in other parts of Guatemala. But the challenge is that there is some opposition to those types of reforms within the Congress that needs to be addressed. These are sovereign decisions that we can help encourage by pointing out the kinds of changes that would remove impediments to investment and remove impediments to broad-based economic growth. That's a continuous effort, and it does require not just the kind of traditional thinking around investment, but thinking about the need to reach communities that have not been touched by prior growth.
Absolutely. And obviously there's a tension between addressing immediate crises and needs on the ground, as well as long-term transformational development efforts. And so how are you thinking about that and mediating that in our last few minutes that we have here? And what would be some tangible goals that you have and the program has that you really think could be achieved in the next 5-10 years?
Well, I think it is important to distinguish between the fact that we have some long-term objectives and we have some short-term needs that need to be addressed. Edgar really pointed out the enormous damage caused by the hurricanes last year, caused by the secondary effects of the pandemic. So I think that we need to focus on some very concrete targets. For example, we need to focus on improving food security on the humanitarian side, improving food security. We need to focus on improving the capacity of governments to respond to natural disasters and having the resources in place prior to that, because we now know, because of climate change, that we are going to see an increasing number of climate-related events in Central America that we are going to have to be permanently ready to respond to. That's on that side. In terms of the longer-term efforts, I think we've said several times that this focus needs to be on the creation of opportunities and a sense of providing the type of environments where people will have options in case of the kinds of crises we're seeing today. And that involves increasing access to banking services. It involves measuring the movement of people from the informal sector to the formal sector, where they may have access to greater protections. It involves measuring access to markets and access to the ability to export. So I think the kinds of things we would be looking for would be not just the top lines of economic growth rates, because those can be misleading. It's who is measuring, who is seeing that growth rate. Are they in the communities that are vulnerable to needing to depart irregularly because of the challenges they face? And are we seeing sort of self-sustaining and work that is going to help reduce, for example, the number of displaced persons in Central America, which is a massive problem. So reducing the number of displaced people, that's something, a target that we're going to be very interested in tracking. And then in the longer term, are we seeing movements where we can see that there is increased access to justice, for example, in cases of domestic violence, but also are governments dealing with and holding accountable public figures and political figures and actors in government that are involved in cases of corruption? So are we seeing increasing impunity or decreasing impunity? Are we seeing signs of increased independence and by courts and making difficult decisions, including challenging those in power when there are potentially harmful activities being carried out by those in that circle? Or are we seeing a continuation of corruption not being punished? These are all indicators that we're going to track, both short-term and long-term.
Great. Thank you. And that provides such a great foundation for our next conversation regarding the integration of those actors and the work of everyone from government to the private sector to civil society. So thank you for your input today, your insight in the work that's ongoing. We really appreciate you being with us today. Thank
you very much for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you. So now we're going to turn over to our panel discussion. And as I was mentioning, we have several more joining us today who can share some perspectives of how they're working on the ground and how they foresee working more collaboratively, more effectively together to address some of these issues related to forced migration. Today we have with us Milady Guilarte. She's the Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Bureau for Latin America and the Caribbean at USAID. We also have João Diniz, who's the Regional Leader, Latin America and the Caribbean for World Vision, and Ricardo Pareja, who is the Head of Sales and Market Development for Humanitarian and Development Division of Mastercard. Thank you, all of you, for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you, Alice.
Great to have you here. And I'd like to follow up on something that the Special Envoy was talking about as well and referenced regarding the Biden administration's efforts and also the Partnership for Central America, which was announced in May after the Vice President Harris's call to action to address root causes of forced migration in the region. And that partnership really brings together private sector companies, social enterprises, and seeks to work with international and multilateral development banks, government agencies, and others more effectively so that, as we were talking about at the outset of this discussion, efforts aren't siloed. They're not short-term or segmented from one another, and that they're actually informed by ongoing work on the ground, by data, and by others, such that those projects can be more collaborative, efficient, effective, and iterative and adaptive to what's happening in real time, rather than, a project is 2 years in duration and then it's not really adapting to what's needed on the ground. So would love to hear from all of you and sort of center our conversation around that. I know each one of you is engaged in a different capacity and is working on the ground from USAID, Mastercard, and also World Vision, as we've heard already with civil society. And with the partnership in mind and this need for multi-stakeholder collaboration, would love to hear how that manifests in the strengths and capacities that are being really leveraged in each one of these areas. So first, I'm going to turn over to you, Milady. Thank you so much again for joining us, and would love to hear from USAID and from your perspective. We know that the Biden administration has committed $4 billion for a multi-year initiative in the region to address forced migration. From USAID's perspective and from a programmatic level, what are your priorities and what does USAID bring to these collaborations, and what are you intending to focus on?
Thank you, Alison. Delighted to be here. Well, I think it's the context that has been provided both by Edgar and Ricardo really lay out the foundation for a lot of the work that we're carrying out. So basically, the Biden's administration approach really comes down to three things: strategy, scale, and sustainability. In terms of strategy, the executive order that was released earlier this year laid the foundation for the interagency, the US government, to respond to the Northern Triangle in a way that is cohesive, collaborative, to identify what are the root causes of migration. That the strategy itself, there's also, another strategy is the collaborative migration management strategy that looks at the legal pathways to migration. In terms of these two strategies, the 5 pillars that make up the strategy that Ricardo mentioned are very much in line with USAID's programming. So currently we're looking at how these 5 pillars that have been identified, that were done in a very collaborative process, consulting various stakeholders in the region, local partners, faith-based organizations, universities, private sector. Through that process, we were able to come up with 5 areas that right now we're looking at aligning each of our countries' cooperative development cooperation strategies to see how best to implement moving forward. The scale piece specifically addresses what you mentioned, the $4 billion request that President Biden has made. It's going to be an interesting process because right now, as we're consulting with Congress, and ultimately, it'll be based and approved on the availability of funds. We want to make sure that we are good stewards of taxpayers' money. So, what can we do with the $4 billion? We recognize that the challenges are paramount, and that more resources are needed. But to ensure that it's not just having the additional funds, but how are we measuring success, right? I think it was mentioned by Edgar. USAID takes a lot of pride in our monitoring and evaluation frameworks. So ensuring that there are strict benchmarks that we have in place to ensure that the strategy for the next 4 years and the $4 billion request is done in the most effective way, right? To achieve results. At the same time, remaining nimble, the conditions on the ground, sometimes the local politics with policy and development assistance are not always in line. I can provide a recent example in El Salvador that USAID decided to redirect its funds from institutions decisions that were made by President Bukele to dismantle really and undermine democratic institutions by the reappointment of judges and so forth. So USAID decided that we did not want to support these institutions and instead pivot and support civil society and local organizations. So again, scalability, but also remaining nimble to be able to respond. And lastly, the sustainability piece, which looks at the long term, ensuring that there's long-term solutions and governance will be key. So we're not only looking at, not just at what we do, but how we're doing it with the view of partnering with our local partners on the ground to ensure sustainability.
And to that point, and to that end, I'd love to turn to João. From your perspective, being on the ground and working with civil society and having worked with a framework of local capacity and resilience building, what lessons have you learned that can inform some of the approaches and programs that are being developed now?
Thank you, Alice. Actually, the simulation and our work on the ground, as you said, it has been a very unique opportunity for us to understand that first, this is a multidimensional problem that encompasses a lot of areas, so that the solution also needs to take into consideration this. Therefore, we need to address this through, as Milady said, and Edgar, Ricardo, on collaborating. But as collaborating, we do need to identify what is the unique and relevant contribution that each organization can make to tackle these problems. That's one. For instance, for us, as you said, we are on the ground. We are in Central America, in all these countries for more than 40 years. We work with more than 3,000 communities, with 5,000 faith-based organizations. So I think besides being a good implementer for this program, but we also have this capacity to mobilize, to convene people, to see how in an integrated way we can work to solve these problems. The other thing is that we do need to consider that we have short needs and long-term perspective to solve the problems. It's not only to think that we need to invest in long-term perspective for solving this, but also the short needs. As Edgar said, last year was a devastating year for all Central America. Immediately, we need to address these needs and integrate it. Understanding that there is a role for the government, understanding for the humanitarian organization, the aid systems, for the corporations, but also that we need to empower and to address and to identify who are the most vulnerable and why, understanding the situation, why they are facing this, and this force to the migration, I think would help us. And finally, Alison, also, we need to consider that technology now is also a powerful drive for us to change this. We tested an early warning system to see how we are able to identify when community is, there is the trend or the risk of people, families to migrate, and why, and how we can intervene there, so that through this multi-dimension intervention, as we did in this simulation, through the collaboration with different actors, and empowering them, especially the youth, the women from this group, I think we can start changing this reality in Central America. Therefore, I think there are a lot of lessons for us to understand this complexity of the situation, and how we can interact, how we can collaborate, but particularly how can we empower them, the communities, to strengthen the governance capacity on the protection systems, and so that through this integrated approach, I think we can start overcoming the reality there.
Thank you. And to that point of connectivity and opportunity, something that we were discussing as part of the simulation, and is obviously a key focal point for all of the work that you're doing, is economic opportunity and lives and livelihoods, and developing the infrastructure, the connectivity to be able to enable that and foster that from the informal sectors to the more formal sectors as well. And I'd love to bring Ricardo, I'd love to bring you into the conversation now to talk a little bit more about that, and to talk about local business development, economic opportunity, and the ways in which Mastercard is engaging in the Partnership for Central America to that end.
Sure. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Foreign Policy for the opportunity to be in this virtual dialogue. I'm also honored to be here with Milady and from USAID, and João, my Brazilian friend. From World Vision, so both great partners of Mastercard in this journey to foster inclusive growth and supporting marginalized communities across the globe, right? Just before I get to your point, Alison, I just wanted to say that many think of Mastercard as a card company, right? But in reality, we don't issue cards, or we don't put terminals into business, right? We're basically a global payments network that connect different organizations, and we basically facilitate digital payments, right? We are kind of the rails of an ecosystem of payments, right? And we connect businesses, consumers, financial institutions, tech players, telcos, NGOs, right? And we've been doing a lot of programs with World Vision and others, governments, right? And it's really about building this ecosystem where we can balance the value and share the value across different players based on the role that they play and the value that they bring to this ecosystem, right? And we've been expanding this ecosystem that started like 6 years ago just with financial institutions, and we've been adding multiple other players, right? And as part of this work specifically that we've been doing around digital and financial inclusion, we've been working for the last 10 years and with an objective to reach 1 billion people to the formal economy, to the digital and the formal economy, which was one of the points that were mentioned here and early by Ricardo, my tocayo. And so basically this objective is what drives us. And we initially started just focus on financial inclusion as our end goal, but we soon realized that financial inclusion is not the end goal, right? But the end goal is to provide those marginalized communities what their needs are, and their needs are really more basics, right? Or how they have access to basic services like education, health, and more importantly, how they have access to jobs and the formal economy, right? And access to government relief programs and other digital and financial services. So this has been most of the work that we've been doing for the last 10 years, right? Specific to the partnership for Central America, as a private sector, right? We believe that our efforts in this digital and financial inclusion taught us some valuable lessons, right? And on how to lift those people from poverty, which would eventually solve for the migration, right? Because one of the main reasons of the migration is that there is a lack of jobs, and lack of jobs bring people to the big cities, that drives to more violence and violence to women. So all those things are all connected, right? And so as a private sector, we believe that by solving or by connecting those people to the formal economy, which means access to basic services, to jobs, and to financial inclusion, is what could eventually solve, not only in the short term, because by doing that in the short term, you can provide relief when there is a humanitarian crisis, right? You can provide government relief for COVID and other things, but you can also solve for the long term, right? So and some examples of our experience, right, show that this displacing cash and making that more formal, right, reduce crime, make business more visible to the financial service, right, enable for credit enable for job creation by entrepreneurship, right, and by allowing people that in more agriculture communities to start producing and generating income through food value chain, right? Cash also carries a lot of costs to the government and also create a lot of leakage and tax, right, that prevent the government to continue supporting the community, right? So this is pretty much the participation that we've been having as part of the work for the partnership for Central America, and our commitment as part of the work is really to digitally and financially include 5 million individuals across the different countries in Northern Triangle, and support the creation of 1 million micro and small business in the next 5 years. So this is the contribution of the private sector, and obviously really focusing on our core competencies, right? But partnering with entities as USAID, as DFC, as World Vision, with the government, like we've been doing in other countries, and also with local actors, right, in all those on those different fronts that I mentioned.
Right, thank you. And the partnerships that you're recognizing are so important, and we've been talking about that quite a bit on this dialogue today. And I'm wondering, as you're all thinking about the plans, the programs, what you're thinking about implementation. It's one thing to identify partnerships, which is so critically important, but then the next step in terms of project implementation and joint execution. And I'm wondering, as each of you are going forward, what risks or barriers you're encountering that are regionally specific and maybe applicable elsewhere too, but what challenges and risks you're encountering, and what potentially could be changed or barriers reduced that would enable you to work more effectively and collaboratively with each other. Ricardo, I'll just go to you first, since you
Yeah.
have like
Sure.
if there are some
Yeah.
concrete areas for action that you could point to, I think that would be really helpful for all
Yeah.
of us.
Sure. As I mentioned, we've been working for more than 10 years trying to develop this whole strategy for engaging with the humanitarian development sector, right? And we always face that a very rigid model of either you are a provider that needs to respond to an RFP and it's pretty much a commodity model, right? Or you are from a private sector perspective participating on a philanthropic fashion, right? And we are really looking for a middle ground, right? So we believe that cross-sector approach is fundamental and is the only effective way to help Central America, right? And so this discussion around public-private partnership is really important, right? And we know that there are several barriers to enable that joint execution, right? And this is pretty much this commercial and contractual mechanisms that in many cases lack, right? Because they are too onto the streams, right? So we believe that one of the things to facilitate the cross sector or multilateral engagement is to first focus on things that are commercially viable, right? So we need to move away from just projects, and I think you mentioned, right, that in many cases these are siloed initiatives that are not connected to each other, right? So our objective as a private sector, and as because we are always entering the market for the long run, right? So our idea is really create this nexus and make sure that things that are being built, they are resilient, they are, user centric, and they are not in silos, right? So creating this model that is commercially sustainable is key, because then it's not just a project that has a budget, but it's something that is really focused on that inclusive growth journey, right?
Great.
And as you mentioned, right? So based on that, we created, as part of the Partnership for Central America, a list of different initiatives that we'll be looking after, which are really focused on the needs and the pain points for the Northern Triangle. Like so for example, we know that there are 3 million people that lack some sort of an identity, right? So providing tools that are not specific to an intervention, but really solving that for the long term, right? So this is one of the things that we are looking at, how we provide more visibility and to those people that are really marginalized and don't have any access to the digital economy, right? The other thing is really the other thing to look at is this lack of emphasis on data privacy, right? In many cases, there is a lot of interventions that are not so structured in terms of how you are engaging with the population and how you are securing their privacy, right? So private sector brings a lot of value when engaging and providing digital solutions that are not siloed, that have the user at the center, right? And as Ron mentioned, digital can really help in this journey, right? So those are some of the challenges and the way we're tackling those.
Great, thank you. And Milady, over to you. If I could ask you from your perspective, I know USAID has been sort of at the forefront also of thinking about programs in an adaptive way and iterating. And so I'm wondering, based on how the agency has operated in the past and how you're envisioning operating going forward and in the region, what are some areas that you foresee adapting, changing to work more effectively with private sector, with civil society, and engage and iterate as you go along?
Thanks, Helen. I think as we look forward, the Administrator Power, one of the first things that she did when she came on board was to launch a Northern Triangle Task Force, which is really an internal mechanism within USAID that includes much more than the Latin America Bureau. So it's really an all hands on deck approach to ensuring that there's sustainability and that there's a set of resources and a set of tools in the toolbox that we can be more agile, right? Be efficient, the agility and speed in which we implement our projects. We're also looking at learning from, things that worked and didn't. As many of you know, President Biden, when he was vice president, this was one of his, top priorities as well, which was to develop the Central America strategy. And we want to make sure that we learn from those experiences, and it's not a continuation, Central America Strategy 2.0, but actually make sure that we apply everything that we can as a U.S. government, but also working with our local partners. In terms of the migration and how we're addressing those root causes, we're relying also on data from local universities, Custom Border Patrol, IOM. So ensuring that we triangulate a lot of this data, which is continuous, it comes on a periodic basis, to adapt and inform our programming. So if we need to pivot and do something differently because it's not working, we make sure that those consultations happen on the ground. USAID, it's a very decentralized agency. So really the work happens in the field. It's led by our mission directors, and there's a top priority right now from the administration to ensure that they're empowered, and that we can support them from Washington as much as possible to ensure that the implementation happens. Something else that we're taking a very hard look at is how to increase the localization of development, right, of foreign assistance. How do we provide more support to local organizations? Congress specifically has been, and also in general, I think criticism is very good and it's needed in order for us to learn. But how can we increase those opportunities to our local partners? So it's something that the administrator is currently reviewing, and that we look forward to making sure that we provide that the tools that are needed for our local partners to be able to absorb, right? The procurement process that USAID has can be quite rigorous and demanding of our local partners. So we want to make sure we move in that direction, because that's one way of ensuring sustainability. I, for one, just spent the last 4 years in the region. I'm an immigrant myself. So these issues really come close to home. And I can understand from a firsthand, experience on the complexities on the ground to be able to move quick and respond to all the requirements that USAID can impose on some of our partners. So we want to make sure that we work jointly to identify those constraints.
Thank you for that. And thank you for that local focus. I think that is a perfect way to transition to João. And unfortunately, our time is short. And so this is going to have to be the last question, but I love this frame and this focus, and would love to hear from you as we close out this session. From your perspective and working with all of the organizations that you are on the ground and across the region, what are some of those interventions that you're seeing are really effective, and also points of entry and ways that organizations, the US government and others can more effectively work together?
Yeah, thank you, Alison. I will be very brief. As Milady said, we need to learn from our experience, and what works, what didn't work. And basically, I think coordination is so critical. All these organizations, we do need to have a strong coordination. That's why we celebrate the Partnership for Central America. The other flexibility, which also in terms of reinventing the way that we work, because if we continue just trying to repeat what we've been doing, I don't think that it's going to work. And particularly, what's our role? Because it's fostering the resilience, equipping, empowering the people there. And based on this, for us, as we work in some of these initiatives, like, for instance, with youth, in terms of unemployment, how to help them to have a better education, to be professionally prepared, and to have access to jobs, as Ricardo said, leveraging the digital opportunity, because that's where we have a lot of opportunity. The other, empowering them in terms of their voice to be listened, to have capacity, particularly the communities. We do have programs like citizen voice and actions to the youth, to the women, to the community, to raise their voice and be heard, to be listened. Programs also to address issues related to the climate change, the dry corridor, considering that it's a very critical area that comes from Guatemala to Nicaragua, how we have a more integrated approach in our programs on economic development, together in terms of strengthening the protection system. So this integrated approach in these different programs that we've been implementing some of the programs, other organizations, yes, as well. But I think we do need to reinvent ourselves and see how to be more flexible, how to coordinate more, so that I think we can overcome all these situations.
Thank you. And thanks to each one of you, you've really highlighted a lot of concrete areas where partnerships can be established and then move from establishing the partnership to joint implementation and execution. So thank you for your insights and your perspective. We really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you.
Now we'll move on to our last session. We're really thrilled to have an honored guest, and it's my pleasure to be joined by Ambassador Luis Fernando Suazo. He's the Ambassador of Honduras to the US. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone. It's a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here, and would love to hear your perspective from Honduras and from where you sit. What are some of the key factors that aren't really well understood or are potentially misunderstood about the challenges facing the region?
Yes, thank you very much. As I said, thank you for inviting to speak me as a panelist today on this topic in today's event. I would like to congratulate everyone and thank everyone that is working on trying to help our people back in our countries and thinking and trying to do the best, everyone, of how to get to them in the people. Addressing the root causes of migration can only be done really by this multi-dimensional approach. Also bearing in mind that this is a phenomenon that occurs for several decades now, and not only in countries in our region, but throughout the hemisphere and other parts of the world also. In this context, we must work on inclusive joint solutions, since no country can assume responsibility by itself and all the solutions by itself. As you were saying today, this morning, I would like to take this opportunity because I feel a great responsibility being this morning with you all. And first and foremost, this responsibility with all the migrants that are now here or are migrating or thinking of migrating. The reason being able to talk to you, everyone that is here, that has relevant mandates or are members of think tanks that help shape policies. And that is why today I want to speak in the name of those human beings, those migrants, those resilient people that from a government perspective. So what is resilience really? It's resist and reinvent both. And as everything we want to solve, the right question is more important than the right answer. So if we do not find the right answer, we might miss the goal. So I thank your question, because yes, I think we're maybe missing parts of the solution, and maybe that won't allow us to get where we want. First, there's for sure reasons that are internal in every country. And I guess, for example, from Edgar already did a very good explanation of what is happening back there. And why? Because World Vision works side by side with the people. So they know exactly what the people need. And this is a question that I have. Have we ever heard about from them what are their problems and why are they making the decisions, and listen from them? Because if not, we might miss the goal here. So I would like to then take this discussion on what I think is missing. I think it's missing the external situation in some contexts that we're facing right now. That maybe we talked about a bit, but I'm not sure that we're taking in account. For example, I would like to say in Honduras regarding corruption related to criminal groups. And as Ricardo Zúñiga said, yes, we do have the problems that he was pointing in all the region. But what I would say is, if we get those political members, will that prevent corruption from or narco trafficking for keeping ongoing? I don't think so. In Honduras, I mean, it's important to do all the efforts, and it's important to send the messages that we do not accept this kind of conduct, and less from officials in our countries. But when we see the broad picture, and the last 5 to 6 years, Honduras made a big effort, and now the homicide rate is down by more than 50%. We invested $1 billion in that time, $1 billion. And what is happening now? So in the southern countries, production of coffee is growing, a record production last year. And also on the consumption side, it's growing. So Honduras is in the center. And we've been dealing with this problem, for example, for 50 years, making and doing things that we have done for the last 50 years, that we have had this war on drugs, for example. So this is gonna keep going. If the narco trafficking continues, that we cannot do that alone and tackle the problem by ourselves. The violence is gonna continue. The kind of corruption that was pointed here will continue. And maybe we should see some other ways to try to really tackle the problem and try to think, what should we do on that side? We talk a bit on what is happening in climate change and how we are expecting more events in Central America, for example. But when we see the 5 pillars and we ask about where is climate change, and the answer we received is, well, it's all across the board. All the pillars integrate the climate change point of view. But we think it is so important and it's so damaging for Honduras that and this is things we should understand better. It's not only that we are receiving maybe more hurricanes and water, but the changing of when it rains and the extension of the droughts are the things that are creating problems and will create more problems, as our people, their livelihood depends on when to plant. And before they knew when to plant, now they don't know when to plant. They plant and then it rains for 5 years and then it doesn't rain for 30 years, for 30 days, I mean. So these is things that we have to I think, understand. And what can Honduras do, for example, on climate change? We've been doing our part, but all the region, Central America region, is less than 0.05% of the emissions. But Honduras is one of the 3 most affected countries. And we can do We cannot do a lot to contain that. So we should bring our eyes in a broader area and try to find solutions in these defiant moments. And one last thing, maybe the context. Yes, I think everyone in this discussion thinks that the first reason is because of economic opportunities. And yes, we do have short-term goals and long-term goals. But what is happening is that we haven't yet, we're not out of this pandemic. And investors, even though that in the whole world, there's a lot of cash in banks there, and they can finance almost anything. The decision making on the sector, it's difficult because they're thinking that with, for example, with the new Delta version of COVID, we might close again the world. So they're not making the decision of investing. So when this happens, we know that governments have to do that, and which is not what naturally that they had to, that they should do. So, but now we have to understand that we have to go and invest in the people, in what is their problem today, and how to help them to get back in their feet. And then we can look on other things.
Thank you for that. And I'd like to follow up on that comment exactly. And so when you think about investing in the people and your recommendation for prioritization of local capacity building efforts and those investments to address both the near-term issues and the longer-term transformative investments that need to be made, what are your priorities and what should be prioritized when we're talking about a more collaborative approach?
Well, we have two sides now. One is the broader one. After the hurricanes, for example, we have now a reconstruction plan that we should get collaboration on that side, cooperation on trying to build on this plan. This is very important. What should the international cooperation do, working with an international community, working with us? So after first recognizing and addressing these external and internal factors, so there's a lot that can be done, and then aligning the cooperation with the plan would be, we guess, a good idea. The other thing is make sure that all the money that is really being allocated for investing in our people gets to our people. And I thank World Vision, because they've been there in Honduras for a long time, and they've been working with the people. So that kind of hands-on programs that goes to the people would be our priority.
Wonderful, thank you. And we're almost over time. So one last question for you, and also for our audience. We have hundreds of people joining us today from around the world, and many of whom are from the region and well outside of that. And what would be some concrete points or action areas that you'd like the audience to take away from our discussion today?
Well, there's a lot we can do. For example, we've been, with the United States, we've been talking about the possibility of reshoring and try to bring companies and investment that is in China and bring it to the region. I'm sure that our countries are ready. We do have the infrastructure. We can invest more. We can have better projects in all the region. But we've been talking about this like now for 12 months, maybe. So we would like all this thinking to go to something that really transforms in what are the actions that have to be taken so the nearshoring can occur. And then we're going to have the kind of opportunities that we need in Honduras, and those are going to be the ones, those kinds of opportunities are going to be the ones that are going to be stabilizing in the long term and keeping people in Honduras. There's a lot of things on how to deal, but understanding that there's not only, as I say, push factors in our countries, but there are also pull factors, and there's they have the same importance. So we should have this broader and integral view of what is happening, and that will allow us to have better solutions. But one thing would be, for example, the nearshoring. We're doing some other things, and our countries are. I'm not only speaking for Honduras. I know what I could tell from Honduras, that we are ready, that we have the infrastructure, we have a great port, the best in the area. We're constructing airports and roads are already built. So, but I know everyone in the region will be more than happy to review if we have to do more in the tax or try to find the right incentives so the nearshoring can occur.
Great, thank you. And thank you for that focus on concrete areas that need to change and mechanisms that can be adapted to foster reshoring, foster local development, and investment in the region to really invest in lives and livelihoods. Thank you for your time today. We're unfortunately out of time for this session, but we really appreciate you being here. We appreciate the time for all of our guests, all of our audience, and thank you all for being here and contributing to this discussion, which is certainly not over, and there's much more to be said and actions to be taken with respect to these issues. So we will be continuing to highlight these conversations and issues as we go forward. So thank you again for joining us today. It was my pleasure to have this conversation, and as I mentioned at the outset, we will be issuing a summary report from the simulation from our discussion today that will include some of these distillation of action areas and recommendations for next steps. A full recording of this event will also be available on FP's event webpage, and that's at foreignpolicy.com/events. Please stay tuned for more from FP. We have a lot coming up in the next week as well. Just to mention a few before we head off today. Next week on Tuesday, on July 27th, we have Farmers on the Frontier of Climate Change, and we'll be talking about global partnerships that can both drive agricultural innovation as well as address climate change and combat hunger. Followed by that, on Wednesday, we'll be releasing some new research from our division from FP Analytics that's looking at the role of local think tanks in advancing policy reform and strengthening democratic governance, something that was certainly touched on here today as well. But thank you again for all of your time, your work, and your interest in these issues. We really appreciate it. Stay tuned and take care. We'll see you soon.